Thank you all so much for coming. As most of you are aware, the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation set out 5 years ago to document the history of every single building in the entire East Village, which is what I'll be discussing today. This talk is premature in a way because we will not be 100% finished with our research for at least another few months, but I wanted to give you at least a flavor of what we've been doing over the past few years. I've chosen tonight to focus mainly on the process of how we've gone about the survey so far, injecting some of our findings along the way. The real meaty findings will come later, once we've wrapped up all of the research and have turned it over to an architectural historian to write a comprehensive report on the history of the neighborhood. In the future, we intend to hold a number of programs based on what comes out of this report. I'm going to take you through a simple who, where, how, and why of this survey. First is who. Our small staff of 5 did not take on this research ourselves. We have been fortunate enough to have had the help of nearly 100 interns and volunteers along the way. Also, none of this research would have been possible without the generous support of the Preservation League of New York State, which awarded us their Preserve New York grant, allowing us to hire an architectural historian once this is all complete to write a comprehensive report based on our research. This report is intended to allow us to begin a discussion with the neighborhood about how to approach preservation in the East Village. Where? Our survey encompasses approximately 80 blocks made up of around 2,500 buildings. That extends up 4th Avenue and the Bowery, across 14th Street, down Avenue D, and along Houston Street. So what we're really looking at in the existing built environment is approximately a 200-year window of architectural history, as the East Village underwent its first major period of growth in the early 1800s. So practically every building that exists today was built within the last 200 years. On this map of the neighborhood in 1824, you can see that most of the blocks east of 2nd Avenue have yet to be developed. The shaded gray areas represent the first blocks to have undergone some sporadic development within our study area. By 1840, development had begun creeping in from the periphery of the neighborhood. This was the result of growing popularity of the area around St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, which is along the western edge of the study area, and the movement of the working waterfront northward from the Lower East Side, which caused development to increase along the East River. And indeed, the surviving pre-1840s buildings that we have discovered in the neighborhood are contained within this area. And except for 8 individual landmarks and a handful of buildings within the small St. Mark's Historic District, shown here in pink, the rest of these pre-1840 buildings lack any sort of protection from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So how does a small organization such as GVSHP begin to tackle such an animal? Well, we begin by breaking the research into 2 components. First, we assess the buildings at face value, in order to learn as much as possible about them before embarking on historic research. Studying the building at face value helps us decide upon approximate era of construction, which helps narrow down the scope of the historic research and cuts down the amount of archival data we'll have to sort through. Once we've exhausted this, we then embark upon historic research in order to pinpoint exact dates of construction and alterations and to find original architects. The first step in our research is scrutinizing current tax maps of each block in the East Village, because a building's footprint reveals a great deal about its possible era of construction, especially in a neighborhood such as this, which has some very dominant building typologies that reveal themselves clearly through the building shapes. Shown here is an example of one of these current maps, displaying the block between Avenue C and D and East 6th and East 7th Streets. These are official maps published by the city and tell us such things as block number, lot number, number of stories, address, and building dimensions. But what we're most interested in for our survey is the building shape. Different building typologies have different footprints. For instance, row houses, which appear on the map in pink, were generally small and took up no more than half the lot, making them fairly easy to spot on a map. Row house construction in the East Village began in the early 19th century and lasted primarily into the early 1860s. The earliest row houses in the neighborhood were constructed in the Federal style and Greek Revival styles. An example of the Federal style can be found at 21 Stuyvesant Street, which was built in 1803. the federal style was popular into the early 1830s, when the more streamlined Greek Revival style came into vogue and lasted through the 1840s. East 7th Street between Avenues C and D has a beautiful row of 1842 row houses that were built for merchants associated with a burgeoning maritime industry along the East River. The next shape we look for is the pre-law tenement. The earliest tenements in the neighborhood were known as pre-law tenements because they were constructed before the passing of the first tenement law in 1879. These tenements have rectangular shapes with no space in between and are more often than not found throughout the neighborhood in rows. These buildings reveal themselves as pre-law tenements with their boxy rectangular shapes, which we can see because the buildings next door have been torn down. One of the most innovative of the pre-law tenement facades is at 101 Avenue A, which is the Pyramid Club, constructed in 1874 by Prussian-born architect William Josie. Pre-law tenement construction ended with the passing of the first of two tenement laws in 1879, which we now call the Old Law. It's called the Old Law because it was followed by a subsequent law in 1901, which we call the New Law. The Old Law required that an air shaft exist between tenements, creating a characteristic dumbbell shape, which makes these buildings very easy to identify on a map. But when spotting this shape, we can say with almost 100% certainty that it was built between 1879 and 1901 when the new law was passed. This is a beautifully preserved row of Old Law tenements on East 14th Street between Avenues B and C, which were constructed in 1890 by the architect George Fred Pelham, who was responsible for the construction of a staggering number of Old Law and New Law tenements in the neighborhood. This was an era in tenement construction when the facades started to get increasingly elaborate and more playful, as the more ornamental Renaissance Revival and Queen Anne styles had become popular by this time. Once housing reformers realized that the required dumbbell air shaft did little to reduce health hazards and overcrowding, they came up with the stricter requirements for light and air that resulted in what we now know as the New Law, passed in 1901. New Law tenements are highlighted on the map in yellow. New Law tenements were generally 6 stories tall and took design cues from the Beaux-Arts style of architecture. Since it was tough to fit the requirements of the New Law onto the standard 25-foot wide lot, these were often found on corners or on wider mid-block lots, such as in the case of these 2 adjacent New Law tenements on 2nd Avenue at 5th Street, both built in 1903 by the architects Hornberger and Straub and Bernstein and Bernstein. In most cases, the tenements in the East Village were built for immigrants, by immigrants, and a small handful of architects are actually responsible for designing the majority of the tenements that remain today. Once we've determined an approximate building date based on building footprint, we then scrutinize the facade of the building itself to try to gauge when it was constructed or altered based on clues. I love this type of work because it's all about sleuthing and piecing the puzzle together. I have been extremely amazed at how much original fabric we have found to exist in the neighborhood, even if we've had to unpeel some stucco alterations or other later changes to uncover it. One of the most revealing features on a building is its brickwork. We keep a special eye out for Flemish bond, which was a pattern of laying bricks in an alternating stretcher and header pattern. This was popular in New York in the early 1800s for Federal and early Greek Revival townhouses, and its popularity lasted until around 1840. If I return to the map presented earlier of pre-1840 buildings, you can see here in red that a great number of them reveal themselves to us through the presence of Flemish bond, making our job a little easier. Sometimes Flemish bond turns up in obvious places, such as on these row houses on East 2nd Street that date from the 1830s. Other times, it pops up in more unexpected places that you might walk by every day and never notice. Upon noticing that the building on the corner of East 3rd Street and the Bowery had Flemish bond on its lower floors, we dug a little deeper and found this photo to reveal that until the 1930s, these were actually 2 separate Federal-style row houses. This building really wears its history on its sleeve. It's on St. Mark's Place, and honestly, I had assumed it was constructed as a tenement and had never really stopped to look at it until I noticed one day that the lintels on the upper floors did not match those below, and that the lower floors had been oddly punched in far below the existing lintels on the lower floors. You'll also notice that there are bits of Flemish bond on the patches around the building. After digging, we found out that the building was actually constructed in 1832 as part of a row that included what is now the landmarked federal house at 20 St. Mark's Place, and that the building, when it was first built, probably looked nearly identical to this one. Just behind those buildings, on East 7th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues, are buildings whose facades also tell us a great deal about their time of construction. At first glance, they appear to date from different eras because of their heights and detailing. But there are several characteristics to notice about them that indicate they were once likely nearly identical. One is that their windows line up, indicating that perhaps they may have been built as part of a row. Another is that the building on the right appears to have at one point lost its stoop, as indicated by the presence of patched brickwork around one of the parlor floor windows. The top floor of this building also has a different brickwork pattern. Flemish bond exists on all the lower floors shown here below the red line. This indicates that this might at one point have been a smaller row house that was heightened and converted to a multifamily home when increasing population density in the neighborhood called for it. This is likely also when the building received its cornice, lintels, and other details that date from the later 19th century. Finally, perhaps most telling is that there is no division in the brickwork where one facade stops and the other begins. This is almost a sure sign that these buildings were constructed at the same time. After digging a little deeper, we discovered that in fact all 4 buildings shown here were constructed together in 1832, and probably looked much like the smallest one in the middle when they were first built. A similar method of analysis can be applied to a number of other buildings throughout the neighborhood. I like to use less obvious examples of this and look at buildings that hide their clues a little deeper and may not be considered exceptional or noteworthy to most people. But if you look deeply enough, all buildings reveal clues. These 2 buildings were built together as row houses in 1845. The building on the left was refaced when it was converted to the mission house for the New York Jewish Evangelical Society in 1928. The one on the right gained an additional story in 1892. Further up the street is another row of houses that were all constructed together in 1845. The 2 on the left were raised an additional story and converted to tenements in the 1880s, which may have been when the building furthest to the right lost its stoop, as indicated by the patchy brickwork on one of the parlor floor windows. 2nd Avenue at one point was filled with early 19th century row houses, and every once in a while, through architectural detail, we're offered a glimpse into this time. This 1849 row house on 2nd Avenue between 9th and 10th Streets still retains its original stoop and doorway. Like many of the remaining row houses along this street, it is now surrounded by later houses and tenement buildings. This 1925 photo from the New York Public Library gives us a glimpse into what 2nd Avenue used to look like when it was lined with row houses. It shows the demolition of a collection of buildings on the corner of 2nd Avenue and 12th Street to make way for the Yiddish Art Theater, which is now the East Village's only building that is both an interior and an exterior landmark. One last thing we look for when surveying the building at face value and before jumping into archival research are any plaques or inscriptions on the building, which may sound obvious, but you need to be careful. In some cases, plaques make our job easy, such as in the case of this beautiful row house on East 13th Street, which was indeed constructed in 1865 as written on the outside of the building. In other cases, these dates can be deceptive, such as in the case of the Manhattan Plaza building on East 4th Street, which has the year 1871 inscribed in its parapet. This building contains Flemish bond on its lower floors and was actually constructed in 1832 as 2 separate row houses that were combined and extended upward in 1871. You may have noticed that 1832 is a very popular development year for this area. Entire rows of Federal-style row houses once lined these western blocks. A similar situation exists on the corner of 1st Avenue and East 7th Street, which also contains Flemish bond on its lower floors. Originally built in 1840, the building was tenementized in 1872, as inscribed in the cornice.